When Evelyn Hart opened the invitation to her ex-fiancé's wedding, she never expected to confront the man who broke her heart. But amidst the lavish event, long-buried emotions resurface, and so does the truth about love and legacy. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Evelyn Hart sat at her kitchen table, staring at the cream-colored envelope in her hands. The return address showed the name that still made her heart skip a beat. Jonathan Whitmore. She knew exactly what it was, his wedding invitation. After 5 years of silence, he had the nerve to invite her to watch him marry someone else. This has to be some kind of joke, she said to herself, running her fingers over the expensive paper. The morning sunlight streamed through her modest apartment's windows, highlighting the dust particles in the air. Her cup of coffee sat untouched, growing cold. She opened the envelope slowly, pulling out the elaborate invitation. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Jonathan Whitmore and Celeste Monroe request the pleasure of your company. The date was set for next month at the prestigious Whitmore estate. The phone rang, startling her. It was her best friend, Marie. Did you get it? Marie asked without saying hello. I can't believe he sent you an invitation. What is he thinking? I don't know what to think, Evelyn replied, her voice shaking slightly. Why would he do this after all this time? Because he's still the same arrogant Jonathan who thinks the world revolves around him, Marie said. Remember how he treated you, how he said you weren't refined enough for his world. Evelyn's mind drifted back to that terrible night 5 years ago. She had been so in love with Jonathan, believing their different backgrounds didn't matter. But at that charity gala, everything fell apart. She had accidentally used the wrong fork during dinner, and Jonathan's mother had whispered something to him. Later that night, he ended their engagement, saying she would never fit into his world. I've changed, Marie, Evelyn said firmly. I'm not that same girl anymore who thought she needed a man like Jonathan to be happy. Then why are you considering going? Marie asked knowingly. Evelyn looked around her apartment. The walls were covered with photos of her dance students and their recitals. She had built a good life for herself, teaching children to dance and helping them believe in themselves. It wasn't the millionaire lifestyle Jonathan had promised, but it was real, and it was hers. Maybe I need to go, she said slowly. Not for him, but for me. To show him and myself that I'm not ashamed of who I am anymore. That evening, Evelyn taught her regular ballet class. As she watched her young students twirl and leap, she thought about how much her life had changed since Jonathan. Back then, she had been willing to change everything about herself to fit into his world. Now she knew better. After class, one of her students, little Sophie, gave her a tight hug. Miss Evelyn, when I grow up, I want to be just like you. Those innocent words brought tears to her eyes. This was who she was now. Someone children looked up to. Someone who had found her own path. That night, Evelyn sat down at her desk and wrote her response to the invitation. Her hand was steady as she checked the will attend box. She added a personal note. Congratulations on your upcoming wedding. Looking forward to celebrating with you both. As she sealed the envelope, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Jonathan. Glad you're coming, Evelyn. It's been too long. Her heart raced, but she didn't respond. Instead, she walked to her bedroom mirror and looked at her reflection. She wasn't the same insecure young woman who had once desperately sought Jonathan's approval. Her brown hair was shorter now, and her eyes held a confidence that came from surviving heartbreak and building herself back up. Time to show them who Evelyn Hart really is, she whispered to herself. The next few weeks flew by as Evelyn prepared. For the wedding, she chose a simple but elegant blue dress that made her feel beautiful without trying too hard. She worked extra hours at the dance studio, focusing on her students instead of her nerves about seeing Jonathan again. Marie helped her pick out accessories, all while questioning her decision. Are you sure about this? You don't owe him anything. I know, Evelyn replied, trying on a pair of silver earrings. But I need to do this. I need to walk into that wedding with my head held high. No more running from the past. The night before the wedding, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She went through old photos she had kept hidden in a box under her bed. There she was with Jonathan, both of them young and in love. She looked at his cocky smile, the way he always seemed to be showing her off like a prize. How had she not seen it then? She put the photos back in the box and pushed it under the bed. Tomorrow, she would face Jonathan Whitmore again. But this Kinheim, she wasn't going as the girl desperate for his love and approval. She was going as herself, Evelyn Hart, dance teacher, mentor, and woman who had learned to stand on her own 2 feet. As she finally drifted off to sleep, she smiled, knowing that whatever happened at the wedding, she was ready. The invitation that was meant to hurt her had instead given her a chance to show Jonathan exactly what he had lost. The morning of 8. Jonathan's wedding dawned bright and clear. Evelyn's hands shook slightly as she applied her makeup in her apartment. She had chosen a deep blue dress that fell just below her knees, elegant but not trying too hard. Her phone buzzed constantly, with messages from Marie asking if she was really going through with this. "Just remember you can leave anytime," Marie's latest text read. "I'll be ready with ice cream and movies if you need me." Evelyn smiled at her friend's concern. The taxi she'd called was waiting outside. As she grabbed her purse and took one final look in the mirror, she whispered to herself, "You can do this." The drive to the Whitmore estate took 45 minutes. With each passing mile, the houses got bigger and the lawns more perfectly manicured. Finally, the iron gates of the estate came into view. Evelyn's stomach churned as she remembered how many times she'd driven through these same gates when she and Jonathan were engaged. "Good luck," the taxi driver said as he dropped her off, seeming to sense her nervousness. The estate was exactly as she remembered it. The sweeping driveway, the marble fountains, the carefully tended rose gardens. Dozens of expensive cars lined the circular driveway. Guests in designer clothes were already gathering on the vast lawn where the ceremony would take place. As Evelyn walked toward the crowd, she heard the whispers start. "Isn't that Jonathan's ex-fiancée? I can't believe she actually came. Did you hear what happened at that charity gala?" She held her head high and kept walking. A waiter offered her champagne, and she took a glass, grateful to have something to do with her hands. Evelyn Hart," a familiar voice called out. She turned to see Richard Preston, Jonathan's best friend from college. "I couldn't believe it when I saw your name on the guest list." Richard gave her a warm hug. He had always been kind to her, even after the breakup. "You look amazing," he said, stepping back to look at her. "Teaching dance, must agree with you." "You've been keeping tabs on me?" Evelyn asked, surprised. "Well, someone has," Richard replied with a meaningful look. "Jonathan might have mentioned once or twice that he'd heard about your dance studio." Before Evelyn could process this information, a hush fell over the crowd. Celeste Monroe, the bride-to-be, was making her way down from the main house. She was tall and slim, wearing an expensive designer dress that probably cost more than Evelyn made in a year. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had never been told they didn't belong. Celeste spotted Evelyn and made her way over, her heels clicking on the stone pathway. "Evelyn, how wonderful that you could come." Her smile was perfect but didn't reach her eyes. "Jonathan mentioned he'd invited you. I hope it's not too awkward for you." "Not at all," Evelyn replied smoothly. "I'm happy to celebrate with you both." "Are you?" a deep voice asked from behind her. Evelyn's heart stopped. She knew that voice. She turned slowly to face Jonathan Whitmore. He looked older than she remembered, but just as handsome. His dark hair had touches of grey at the temples now, and there were fine lines around his eyes. He was wearing an expensive suit that fit him perfectly, and his trademark confident smile was firmly in place. But something flickered in his eyes when he looked at her, something that made Celeste step closer to him and wrap her arm around his. "Jonathan," Evelyn said calmly, proud that her voice didn't shake. "Congratulations on your wedding day." "I'm glad you came," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "You look different." 5 years is a long time," Evelyn replied. "People change." "Do they?" Jonathan asked softly. The question hung in the air between them. Celeste cleared her throat. "Darling, we should greet the other guests, and I need to finish getting ready." She tugged gently at Jonathan's arm, but he didn't move immediately. "Of course," he said finally, still looking at Evelyn. "We'll catch up later?" Evelyn nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched as Celeste led Jonathan away, noticing how the bride kept glancing back at her with worried eyes. Richard appeared at her side again. "Well, that was interesting," he said, handing her a fresh glass of champagne. "Want to know something funny? That's the first time I've seen Jonathan rattled in years." "He's not rattled," Evelyn protested. "He's getting married in an hour." "Exactly," Richard said meaningfully. "He's getting married in an hour, and he just spent 5 minutes staring at his ex-fiancée like she's a ghost come back to haunt him." More guests were arriving now, filling the lawn with chatter and laughter. Evelyn found herself being introduced to various members of high society, all of them curious about the woman who had once been engaged to Jonathan Whitmore. She answered their questions politely, but revealed little. As she stood there, sipping her champagne and watching the crowd, She couldn't help but notice that Jonathan kept looking in her direction. Each time their eyes met, something passed between them, a current of unfinished business, of words left unsaid. "The ceremony will begin in 30 minutes, a wedding coordinator announced, moving through the crowd. Evelyn watched as Jonathan was ushered inside to prepare. Just before he disappeared through the grand doors, he looked back one last time. Their eyes met across the crowd, and in that moment, Evelyn saw something in his expression that made her heart race doubt. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. She hadn't come here to disrupt anything. She'd come to prove something to herself. But as she took her seat among the other guests, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wedding was about to become much more complicated than anyone had planned. The wedding guests took their seats as soft violin music filled the air. Evelyn sat in the middle rows trying to blend in with the crowd. She watched as Jonathan took his place at the altar, looking every bit the successful businessman in his black tuxedo, but she noticed how he kept fidgeting with his cufflinks, an old nervous habit she remembered well. "He's been doing that all morning," Richard whispered, sitting down next to her. "I haven't seen him this nervous since the day he was going to propose to you." Evelyn shot him a warning look. "Richard, please, I'm just here as a guest." "Are you?" he asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're the only person in this crowd who makes Jonathan Whitmore lose his famous cool." Before she could respond, the wedding march began to play. Everyone stood and turned to watch Celeste make her entrance. She was a vision in white, her dress probably worth more than most people's cars. Her father, a well-known senator, walked her down the aisle with pride. Evelyn glanced at Jonathan's face as he watched his bride approach. He was smiling, but something was off. His eyes kept darting to the side, finding Evelyn in the crowd. Each time their eyes met, he would quickly look away, but not before Evelyn saw the conflict in his expression. Celeste reached the altar, and her father placed her hand in Jonathan's. The priest began the ceremony, his voice carrying across the perfectly manicured lawn. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Evelyn's mind wandered to another day, 5 years ago, when she and Jonathan had been planning their own wedding. They had wanted something smaller, more intimate. That was before his mother had taken over the planning, before everything had become about appearances and social status. If anyone can show just cause why these two should not be joined in matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The traditional words brought Evelyn back to the present. She felt several guests glance in her direction, probably hoping for some dramatic interruption. She kept her face carefully neutral, her hands folded in her lap. The ceremony continued, but the tension in the air was growing thicker. Jonathan's voice shook slightly as he began his vows. "I, Jonathan, take you, Celeste." Suddenly he stopped. There was a long pause. Too long. Whispers started among the guests. Celeste's smile became fixed and uncertain. "Jonathan," the priest prompted gently. Jonathan cleared his throat and started again. But as he spoke the words, his eyes drifted to Evelyn. Celeste noticed. Everyone noticed. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said abruptly. "I need a moment. Just a moment." He turned and walked a few steps away from the altar, leaving Celeste standing there alone. The crowd broke into concerned murmurs. Evelyn's heart was pounding so hard, she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Celeste's mother rushed to her, daughter's side, whispering furiously. The wedding planner was having what looked like a panic attack. Jonathan's mother, Eleanor Whitmore, stood up from her front row seat and marched over to her son. "Jonathan," she hissed, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "what do you think you're doing? This isn't about you anymore. Think about the merger with the Monroe family's company." Evelyn felt sick. So that's what this wedding was really about. Business. She should have known. Everything in Jonathan's world came down to business and social standing in the end. Jonathan turned back to the altar, his face a mask of determination. "I apologize, everyone. Please, let's continue." The ceremony resumed, but the damage was done. Everyone had seen Jonathan's moment of doubt. Everyone had seen where he was looking when the words stuck in his throat. Celeste's smile never quite returned to its former brightness. Her "I do" sounded more like a challenge than a promise of love. When Jonathan kissed her, it was quick and formal, nothing like the passionate kisses Evelyn remembered. As the newly married couple walked back down the aisle, Jonathan's eyes found Evelyn one last time. In that moment, she saw everything he couldn't say: regret, longing, and something else that made her want to run away from this perfect wedding on this perfect lawn. The guests began moving toward the reception area, but Evelyn stayed in her seat for a moment, needing to catch her breath. Richard touched her shoulder gently. "You okay?" he asked. "I shouldn't have come," she whispered. "This was a mistake." "Maybe," Richard said, helping her up. "Or maybe this is exactly where you needed to be. Come on, the reception's starting, and something tells me it's going to be even more interesting than the ceremony." As they walked toward the reception tent, Evelyn could see Eleanor Whitmore giving orders to the staff, trying to maintain the appearance of a perfect society wedding. Celeste was surrounded by her bridesmaids, all of them talking in low, worried voices. And Jonathan was standing alone, staring at his champagne glass, like it held all the answers he was looking for. The afternoon sun was starting to cast long shadows across the lawn, and Evelyn could feel in her bones that this wedding day was far from over. The real drama, she suspected, was just beginning. The wedding reception was held in an enormous white tent on the Whitmore Estate's south lawn. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and each table was decorated with towering flower arrangements that probably cost more than Evelyn's monthly rent. The band played soft jazz as the guests found their seats. Evelyn discovered she'd been placed at a table far from the main wedding party, clearly Celeste's doing. She sat down next to Richard and a few other guests who seemed just as interested in gossip as the champagne. "Did you see Jonathan's face during the ceremony?" One woman whispered. "I haven't seen anything that dramatic since my sister's second divorce." "And did you notice how he kept looking at that ex-fiancée of his?" another added, not realizing Evelyn could hear every word. "The dance teacher?" Richard squeezed Evelyn's hand under the table. "Ignore them," he whispered. "They're just bored with their own lives." The band announced the arrival of the newly married couple. Jonathan and Celeste entered the tent to polite applause, but everyone could see the strain between them. Celeste's smile looked painted on, and Jonathan moved like a man walking to his own funeral. "Ladies and gentlemen," the band leader announced, "please welcome Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Whitmore for their first dance." Jonathan led Celeste to the dance floor. As they began to move to the music, Evelyn couldn't help but remember how she and Jonathan used to dance together. He had been so different then, more relaxed, more genuine. Now his movements were stiff, mechanical. "Speaking of dancing," Richard said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "did you know Evelyn runs the most successful dance studio in the city? Her students just won the regional championships." Several people turned to look at Evelyn with new interest. She saw Jonathan's head turn slightly, obviously listening. "It's not that big of a deal," Evelyn said modestly. "I just love teaching children to believe in themselves." "Don't be so modest," Richard continued. "I heard you even got offered a chance to open a second studio." This time Jonathan definitely turned his head, missing a step in his dance with Celeste. She stumbled slightly, her face flushing with embarrassment. The first dance ended, and other couples joined the dance floor. Eleanor Whitmore swept past Evelyn's table, phone in hand. "The Monroe family's stock just dropped 5 points, she muttered to her husband. "This wedding needs to look perfect for the business papers tomorrow." Evelyn felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Jonathan standing there, his hand extended. "Would you honor me with a dance, for old time's sake?" The tent went quiet. Celeste, who was talking with her bridesmaids, turned to stare. Eleanor Whitmore looked like she might faint. "I don't think that's appropriate," Evelyn said quietly. "Please," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you." Against her better judgment, Evelyn took his hand. As they moved onto the dance floor, she could feel hundreds of eyes watching them. Jonathan's hand was warm on her waist, and despite everything, they still moved together perfectly. "You've done well for yourself," he said softly. "The dance studio, the championships, I've been following your success. Why did you invite me today, Jonathan?" Evelyn asked directly. The truth this time. He was quiet for a moment, leading her through a turn. I thought seeing you would prove something." "Prove what?" "That I'd made the right choice. That leaving you was the smart business decision." His voice cracked slightly. "Instead, seeing you here, seeing how you've grown, how strong you've become." "Stop," Evelyn said firmly. "You're married now. You just said your vows less than an hour ago." "Vows based on a business merger," he said bitterly. "Did you know? Celeste's father's company is the key to expanding Whitmore Industries into Europe. Mother made it very clear this marriage was non-negotiable." The music was ending, but Jonathan held on to her for a moment longer. "I've missed you, Evelyn. I've missed who I was when I was with you." Before Evelyn could respond, Celeste appeared beside them. "Mind if I cut in?" Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were cold. I'd like to dance with my husband. Evelyn stepped back quickly. Of course. Congratulations again to both of you. As she walked back to her table, she could hear Celeste and Jonathan arguing in harsh whispers on the dance floor. The other guests pretended not to notice, but everyone was watching the drama unfold. Well, that was quite a show, Richard said. As Evelyn sat down, Are you okay? I need some air, Evelyn replied, standing up again. She hurried out of the tent into the evening air, her mind spinning with Jonathan's words. Behind her, she could hear Eleanor Whitmore's voice rising. Jonathan, fix this right now. The Monroe merger depends on this marriage looking perfect. Evelyn walked toward the rose garden, needing to escape the tension in the tent. But she had only gone a few steps when she heard footsteps behind her. Evelyn, wait! It was Jonathan's voice. We need to finish our conversation. She turned slowly, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The sun was setting behind the Whitmore mansion, casting long shadows across the lawn, and somewhere in the distance thunder rumbled. A storm was coming. Evelyn stood in the rose garden, her heart pounding as Jonathan approached. The evening air was heavy with the threat of rain, and distant thunder rolled across the sky. Behind them, the reception tent glowed like a giant lantern, music and voices spilling out into the darkness. You can't just walk away, Jonathan said, moving closer. Not again. I walked away? Evelyn's voice rose with disbelief. You ended our engagement because I used the wrong fork at a dinner party. You told me I'd never fit into your world. I was wrong, Jonathan said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. I was stupid and wrong, and I've regretted it every day since. Stop it, Evelyn said firmly. You just married another woman, a woman who's probably wondering where her husband disappeared to on their wedding day. As if on cue, Celeste's voice cut through the darkness. He's right here, with his ex-fiancée. How predictable. She stepped into view, her white wedding dress practically glowing in the dim light. I knew inviting you was a mistake. This was your idea? Evelyn asked Jonathan, pieces falling into place. Celeste didn't know you invited me. Of course I didn't know, Celeste laughed bitterly. I found the invitation on his desk after he mailed it. He said it was about closure. Clearly he lied. More footsteps approached. Eleanor Whitmore and Celeste's father, Senator Monroe, both looking furious. Jonathan, what are you doing? Eleanor demanded. The reporters from the business section are waiting for photos. The Monroe merger. Oh, stop it, Mother, Jonathan shouted, making everyone jump. For once in your life, can you think about something other than business? Deals? Don't you dare take that tone, Eleanor snapped. Everything I've done has been for this family's future. The merger with Monroe Industries will make Whitmore Corp.